is a word cloud of y'all's impressions of Southeast Asia. Inevitably, when I teach this class, this is the part of the world that folks are often most confused on in terms of what is actually in this location. So you see Japan is looming large here. Often people have China and Japan as part of Southeast Asia. And what we're actually thinking about when we look at Southeast Asia is that sort of bottom most south and east corner of the continent, and that includes what you could call peninsular Southeast Asia, as well as a lot of the islands in between Asia and Australia. If we look at the political map of this area, we can see a number of countries, Japan not one of them, but Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines as the island nations, and places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Burma or Myanmar as the peninsular parts of Southeast Asia. This is a really interesting part of the world because it really has a lot of shared culture. You can think of it as kind of a crossroads between the sorts of cultures that you find in East Asia or China, Japan, and Korea, and South Asia, so India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. So there's really a melding of cultures in Southeast Asia that combines both of these other parts of the world. If we look at the landforms here, this area is very tectonically active. We have the combination coming together of multiple different plates. You have the Eurasian plate that has the continent of Eurasia on it, the Pacific plate, and the Philippine plate. So there's a lot of tectonic activity, which means volcanoes, tsunamis, earthquakes, mountains, glaciers at high elevations, and deep sea trenches. You can see off the southern coast of Indonesia a very deep sea trench, the Java Trench, shown there along in the red. And then you have various mountains that are built, that have built over time through volcanic activity into a lot of the island archipelagos, such as Indonesia. So if we look at the landscape of this region, you can kind of classify it into two different categories. On the mainland, so peninsular Southeast Asia, it's mountainous. You have a lot of flat river valleys and deltas and coastal plains, and the majority of the population lives in these river valleys, deltas, and coastal plains because of the accessibility, the access to the river, and also as good land for agriculture. On the islands, you have this volcanic activity that creates high mountains and relatively young landscapes in terms of geologic time, so recently developed land. And so with those high volcanic mountains, you have a relatively narrow coastal plain because there hasn't been a lot of erosion yet to create larger coastal plains. So this is what you see in terms of the landscape in Indonesia and the Philippines. One of the major physical features that's also helped shape the culture of peninsular Southeast Asia is the Mekong River and the Mekong River Basin. So the Mekong River flows 2,600 miles from Tibet to Vietnam. So again, we see that importance of the Tibetan Plateau as that high elevation, having a lot of storage of water in terms of the snowpack, things like that, feeding rivers into East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. So the Mekong flows through Laos, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And as we mentioned before, because of the landscape, the river valleys are key sites of human occupation and of agriculture. They also serve as important transportation corridors to move people and goods between different countries and within countries as well. So one of the interesting things we can think about things like a river basin, which is a sort of scale that shows all of the water that flows into a particular river, is this: if you look at things at the scale of the river basin, it often doesn't correspond to the scale of political boundaries. So you have the river flowing through all of these different countries. And these different countries all have different strategies on managing the river, wanting to have access to that as a resource. So you have things like dam building along the river. If you build a dam upstream, it might really be of concern to folks that are living downstream because they might not have access to that water. It might change the flow of the river. If you have a dam break or something like that upstream, it could have really detrimental effects. So using the river as a resource has been something that has really fostered a lot of need for international cooperation between different countries to be able to effectively use and manage this as a resource. And here's some examples of those sorts of landscapes. On the left here we have a karst landscape in Vietnam, and on the right canals with market boats in Bangkok, Thailand. So again, the river is very important as a transportation and market corridor. If we look at volcanic activity specifically in terms of the physical geography, some of the island nations within Southeast Asia are part of that Pacific Ring of Fire, and have had major volcanic eruptions, such as Krakatoa in Indonesia in the late 1800s, and Pinatubo in 1991 in the Philippines. This creates some burdens and some benefits. The ash that's deposited from volcanic eruptions is extremely high in nutrients and creates very rich soils that can support high population densities. But of course, there's also a tremendous threat in terms of human life from the dangers of volcanic eruption and the things, sort of things that those can pose for folks. Another example of physical geography sort of problem from this tectonic activity is the tsunami that happened in 2004 in Indonesia. Now, the epicenter of this was off the coast of Indonesia, and the tsunami created a huge wave that traveled throughout the area and caused major devastation. Some of the satellite pictures here on the left show Banda Aceh, which is the city that was the capital of one of the northern provinces in Indonesia. And you can see the difference between June 2004, before the tsunami, on the left, where you can see buildings, trees, infrastructure. On the right, in December after the tsunami, almost all of that is wiped out. If you look at the picture of the landscape here, the only thing that's left standing is the mosque. So it really had a tremendous toll in terms of property and in terms of human life. Nearly 300,000 people had died, 500,000 people injured, and 1.6 million people displaced from the disaster. So really a tremendous, tremendous toll on the area. Some of the lasting effects included pollution of salt water into local wells, salt water into the agricultural land, the rice paddies and the orchards that were in the area. The fishing industry lost crews and equipment. There was a decline in tourism, and there was different impacts depending on the gender of folks. So, for example, you have a gender division of labor where many of the men were employed as fishermen and many of the women stayed at home and cared for children. Much of the devastation and the lives that were lost were on the land. So you have places where almost all of the women in particular cities were wiped out. So there was a real gender division of space, and then that impacted how the devastation from the tsunami affected folks. Of course, there's also a huge economic impact in terms of loss of life, livelihood, and the necessity to rebuild the area after this devastation as well.